Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is well. I'm going to be sharing my screen so you can follow along with me as we go through. The survey results are very positive, so I think you'll be very encouraged as those come through. Let me first make sure that you're able to see the screen. Can everyone see that okay? Yes. Very good. Okay. Slideshow start. There we go. So just as a reminder, Cobalt, we are a 501c3 not-for-profit. We're based here in Michigan. We work across the country with communities very much like yours on community planning and other kinds of data issues. Study goals. Really, we wanted to support the budget planning, the strategic planning, and policy decisions that you're looking at. Again, coming in and checking those baseline measures to see how you're doing, to make sure you've got a good distribution of services locked in so you can come back and measure progress in the future. Understand if your presumed service experiences are actually accurate in the eyes of your residents, and look to see which experiences residents have that have the most resonance for them, that are the strongest drivers of outcome behaviors like remaining in the community, the recommending to others, and those types of things. So I always like to start by jumping straight to the bottom line. So your score based on the ACSI was a 78. The ACSI goes from 0 to 100, with 100 being a perfect score that no community gets, and 78 is an extremely solid score, as you'll see in a minute when I compare you to some of the benchmarks. There were 5 areas that really had the strongest effect on overall satisfaction and those outcome behaviors that I talked about. And these aren't low scores, these are just the things that are the most highly leveraged in moving your score up or down in the future. And those 5 areas: Township Services, Community Image, Public Works, Police Services, and Transportation Infrastructure. There were a lot of themes about walking and cycling, school, safety, parks. All of these are things that your community members really value and that they want to make sure I continue to stay as a high priority. They would like to see more in the lines of music and art and food events, more diverse kind of events. They would like to get more information on community events and various township projects that are going on, including start dates, end dates, with some of the traffic things and so on. There was a lot of work that we did in the survey looking at broadband, and you have about 66% of your residents supporting a millage for broadband. Currently, they're paying about $90 a month for the service that they have. About 80% support continuation of the deer management program. And there were a number of individuals who also signed up because they're interested in participating in potential future planning workshops, focus groups, and so on. So overall, this is kind of your executive summary. Really solid response from folks, and I think there's some good actionable information that we'll get to in just a minute. Methodology, it was a random sample of 1,500 voters. We had really good response, 386 residents. At the time we had to close it. That gives you plus or minus 5%. The question that comes up all the time is that enough of a sample to represent a community of our size? And the answer is yes. For a national survey to get plus or minus 5%, you really only need to have 384 responses. And so you're in a very good place from a statistical standpoint. We did weight the results based on ethnicity just to adjust that because there was a little bit of a skew there. In addition, the survey was open to residents who were not part of the random sample, so that all of those voices could be heard as well. We heard from about 66 residents, so you had a total of 452 responses. So if you had all of those folks back there in the boardroom, it would be a very full room. One of the things that we like to point out from a statistical standpoint is that those folks who are not part of the random sample are not included in the results that I'm going to be going over today. But in the crosstabs, which you probably received, and it's a very dense set of information, there is a row on that so that for every question, you know how the non-sample respondents, how they felt and what their experiences are. So their ideas certainly are not lost in this. I talked a little bit about the crosstabs. And this is a tiny sliver of it if you haven't cracked it open yet, but essentially every survey question in the survey has its own column, and every demographic cohort has its own row. So this is just a couple of areas just to give you a little tiny taste of it. But we add the shading because there's so much when you actually look at the spreadsheet that your eyes can't cross. So the blue shows where the scores are relatively high, and the red shows where the scores are relatively low, so you can kind of draw your eyes to your strengths and relative weaknesses. The other thing is that as you're looking at an individual question and dropping down the row, you can see what are the experiences of these individual cohorts. And also you can see if the experiences are pretty consistent across cohorts. So really, if it's all blue or all pink, you know, regardless of background, people are having pretty similar experiences. If there's some checkering like we have over here in terms of transparency and sharing information, then you know there's a little bit of a difference in terms of what that perceived experience is. So those are things that you might want to pay a little bit more attention to if this is an area that you wanted to spend time looking at and shoring up. But again, like I said, this is just a quick glance at how that works. The scale that we use for the township questions were from 1 to 6. And so you'll see a lot of these scores, you know, there are very few that drop down below 3. So very solid performance. All right, let's start diving into the results. So I talked about some of the comparability to outside benchmarks. We didn't do this for all of the questions, but I wanted to give you some sense of how well you're performing compared to your peers. So your overall score was a 4.9 on that 6-point scale. That translates to a 78 on the American Customer Satisfaction Index. For the nation, for communities, the average is 67, so you are 11 points above the national, and 69 for similarly sized communities. Midwest, you can see what those scores are, 66 and 74, and Michigan, 67 and 64. So you're doing really well overall in terms of the kind of value that you're delivering today. One of the things that we do with all of the questions is we take them and we throw them into this kind of scatter plot. So the perceived performance, so that rating from 1 to 6 is on the vertical. So your relatively higher scoring areas are in the top. Your relatively lower scoring areas are in the bottom. And then we have the impact, the correlation with overall satisfaction plotted across the horizontal. So things that are more over on the right-hand side are the things with a stronger relationship to overall satisfaction. Things that are on the other side have a weaker association with overall satisfaction and all of those outcome behaviors that are tied in with it. So we took all of those questions, we summed them up into categories with these different dimensions, and we plotted them there. And one of the things that I want to point out with the scale is that it starts at a 3. So even your lowest scoring areas still appear close to a 4.2. But we do this when we zero in on the clusters so that you can see the relative differences between each of these areas. So all of your areas performed well, but you know, from a relative standpoint, some areas are stronger than other areas. And again, these are the areas that are on the right that have stronger linkage with overall satisfaction. Things over here on the left-hand side have a weaker correlation with overall satisfaction. One of the questions that always comes up is fire department. So your fire department is doing a fantastic job in terms of the services that they provide, but it's not way over here on this this high impact side. And the reason for that is because we're not measuring importance, we're measuring how closely these are linked to overall satisfaction. And the way to think about this is if you were to buy a car, you're thinking about what are the different attributes that a car has that would help you choose one model from another. It might be the pricing, it might be the safety, it could be the mileage, but it's not whether or not it has a steering wheel. Are steering wheels are they important? Yes, absolutely, they're super important, but it's not the thing that differentiates one car from another necessarily. And that's really how fire departments are, and I apologize to the fire chief. But the fire is very important, but it's not the thing that helps decide from one area to another in terms of where people live. You can see the other areas. Police, definitely a strong area. You're doing well. It matters a lot. Public Works, which also performed well. Community Image, a little bit softer than Township Services. We'll get to those a little bit more in a minute. And each of these, I'll be breaking them out into their individual component questions for the ones over here on the right. I'm not going to hit everything just from time constraints, but you'll have that available in your packet. And once you see me go through this, you'll understand how to read these charts. So first of all, law enforcement. This is an area that I wanted to look at just because of all of the issues that have been going on in the news over the last year. And you can see your scores, you know, well above 5 in most areas, a little bit softer here in transparency, but overall, really strong scores. On the ACSI scale, this turns into about an 86, which is a very strong score. So your officers are doing a fantastic job, and so they need to be encouraged. What they're doing is appreciated and recognized by the residents of the township. So then what we do is we take each of those bars and we plot them into this scatter chart. So you can see the relative importance, the relative impact of some compared to the others. And you can see the transparency and sharing information is the area that the department might want to take more time looking at in terms of what can they do to be found. It's still a very strong score. So this is definitely a tuning kind of conversation. But this is the relative weakness that matters the most for them in terms of moving that score even higher. Other areas, engagement with the community, response time to emergencies, all fantastic scores, and these are strengths that continue to resonate with your residents. We had a number of questions regarding parks. We asked them how often we use them. They used them in the past year. You can see that only about 14% of your residents did not use your parks and trails at all in the last year. So there's very heavy usage, particularly in this time of pandemic. We had a number of different aspects of the Parks and Recreation programs and facilities that we wanted to rate. Again, on the same scale, you can see a particularly high score for Marketplace on the Green Farmers Market, high score for the Harris Nature Center, high score for Historical Village, a little bit softer in terms of the variety of recreational programs. And that's actually something that we've seen across the board with our clients when we're looking back to the last year. Particularly heavy users, they have a certain addiction to recreational programs, and when we had to close things down, they felt that a little bit, but still, it's a very good score. Looking at that scatter chart, things that are really the most closely linked with overall satisfaction, we got the variety of recreational programs, the variety of park amenities, park facility cleanliness, and the quality of park amenities like the trails and playgrounds and so on. And all of these are high in the charts. These are strengths that are continuing to move your score over. They're lifting your overall satisfaction score. Looking at transportation infrastructure, so you can see a very solid score for your pathway systems for biking and walking. CATA had good solid scores. Street service maintenance and repair. Everywhere I go in the Midwest, it seems to be the same story, and it's the same for you as well. So streets are definitely a concern for your residents. When we break it into the chart, you can see the one that really crosses the line the furthest, again, the street tree maintenance and care. So that's something that you want to look at. Street service maintenance and repair, while it's the lowest score, it actually was not quite as impactful as the tree maintenance. But still, both of these are areas that have a fair amount of impact in them, so you'll want to spend some time looking at ways to continue moving forward on that, and really building the awareness of what you're moving forward on, what the plan is, how the decisions are made, and so on. Looking at public works, strong scores.
Can I stop here for a second?
Particularly. Sure.
Could you go back one screen? You've got the horizontal line there drawn at about 4.9 rather than what would be 3.0, which would be the halfway point between 1 and 6. Is the 4.9, why is that used in all your survey results? Is it unique to ours? And the same with the vertical line drawn there about 0.4.
Sure. That's a good question. It is drawn in different places based on which particular client we're working with. And this is based on when we draw the cluster of all of your questions. So we have a scatter plot with 80-some different questions on there. This is the center point of where all of those questions fall. And then we lock them in the same place. So as we're going through all of these slides, you can see the relative importance in terms of where each of these areas show up. Based on that same kind of crossroads there in the middle.
Okay, so you're using that same cross point for every one of these scatter point grids.
That's correct. Yep. So if you're here, same cross point.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. So Public Works. Ease of paying township utility bills, very high score in terms of the respectful treatment of residents. Good customer service, drinking water quality very high, stormwater and drain maintenance lower score, and I know that you've had some issues here in the past, so I think that shows up here in this particular survey. And then the snow management on trails and pathways also is a little bit of a softer score too. When we look here, it's really the stormwater drain maintenance that has the most impact from a negative standpoint, that's pulling the score down the most for this group. But areas that you're doing particularly well is response time to emergencies, the respectful treatment of residents, treatment of residents, and the customer service levels that are provided are definitely strengths that are lifting the scores. Township Services, sort of a general catch-all category. plan review, very strong scores. A number of things that are kind of cut across here at the 4.5 line, a little bit weaker with your rental inspections and the code enforcement, property maintenance for your neighborhood. And when we drop into the crosstabs, you can see that both the rental inspections and the code enforcement, property maintenance in the neighborhood, both were the low scoring areas, and they were over here on the right. And I think there's a little bit of a concern about the township continuing to stay on top of light type of issues. So that shows up here. We had some open-ended questions in the survey, and what we do with those is we take all of those comments, we drop them into a word cloud software, and we look at the word counts and which ones come up the most often, and that's tied in with the size of the words. And you had lots of comments. The three words that really came out the most that represented different themes were affordable, walkability, and incentives in terms of what would make Meridian Township a better place for businesses. Around affordable, just the cost of rent continues to go up, taxes and those kind of things that are always a challenge in terms of maintaining profitability, particularly in tax building. Walkability, strong theme throughout the survey. People just want to have more walking paths. They want to have more bike lanes. They want to have that whole infrastructure continuing to be emphasized and developed and maintained. And then incentives, from a business standpoint, tax incentives and those kind of things are always welcome. I don't know if either of these communities are in the National Main Street program, but that's something that you might want to think about as well in terms of managing some of those types of approaches. Looking at what barriers prevent residents from participating more in events going on downtown or make them more likely to not be in the community 5 years from now. Again, an open-ended question. Lots of comments about this that you can read on your own. But the main themes were age, time, and tax. So age, you have a cohort of residents that just feel that the events and things that are going on just don't really aren't as accessible for them as they could be. So as you think about the menu of things that are offered, that's one consideration to put into it. Time, this is a typical thing. People have a lot on their plate. And then from a tax standpoint, a number of folks mentioned that they are thinking about moving just from a tax perspective. So it's not just specifically Meridian Township, they're actually looking at moving out of state. What kinds of cultural events would they be interested in? Well, music, art, and foods, particularly things that have a little bit of an ethnic angle to them. So you can see lots of different ideas, and as you guys start going to that phase of your planning, it's a fun set of comments to go through. There's a lot of creativity. Looking at the community image, safe place to live, very strong score for an enjoyable place for children, and enjoyable place for older adults, a safe place to bike and walk. So those are all great things to do well. A couple of areas that were a little bit softer. A great place to have a business that came in a little bit lower than I think what you'd like to see. Enjoyable place for young adults. A little bit softer also with a physically attractive, great curb appeal. This ties in with some of those concerns regarding code enforcement and rental inspections. So those are the things that really jumped out to me as I was looking at some of these overall scores. Looking at the scatter plot, we can see that the ones that are kind of the most loaded in terms of opportunity to drive your score higher, community that's growing responsibility, you can see that here, and that's often the communications opportunity to talk more about that. A great place to have a business, physically attractive, great curb appeal is here. The perfect community for me is pretty much on the line, so it's not really so much of a detractor. Enjoyable place for people to visit is over here, right here on the edge. As far as two strengths, it's the enjoyable place for children and older adults. So those are things to put on the bumper stickers in terms of things that people really do love about the community and what they see about it. What do you like most about living in Meridian Township? Well, first of all, safety. That came through loud and strong. Parks. You've got a bunch of park addicts in the township. They love it. They love the walking. They love the amenities. They love all of those kind of things. There were some concerns about access for people with disabilities, so that's something that you'll want to take a look at. And schools. You've got a great educational system over there in that particular area. So that was certainly recognized and was a big reason that people come and why people stay. Top improvements to prioritize. Diversity, you can see that popping up here. People just want that to continue to be an area of attention, not only in terms of the events that we talked about before, but also in terms of entertainment options and some of the different types of businesses downtown, just to get more of that variety, to get a little bit more of that ethnic representation going on. Roads, well, like a lot of places, improved road conditions, but also expanded bike lanes and traffic enforcement came up quite a bit around the roads. The sidewalks, people want to have more sidewalks, and they want to make sure that they are well lit. How do you prefer to receive information? Emails number one, Prime Magazine, Township website. These vary by some of the different demographic groups, so as you're looking at some of the communication efforts, you'll want to dig into that detail, but those are your big three. What kind of information do they want? Well, number one, the community events. So that continues to show up over and over throughout the survey. Township projects, what's going on, when do things start, when are things going to be wrapped up, and then other kinds of township news, what's going on. We wanted to find out a little bit more about what languages are spoken in the home, and while English was the number one thing that came up on it, you can see there's a great variety of languages that are spoken. So again, that just reflects, that interest in diversity and multicultural opportunities within the township. We had a number of questions on internet providers. You see that Comcast was the number one provider in the township, followed by AT&T, and then you've got a handful of folks that show up on the radar, but not very much. It's really a Comcast market. We asked, what are they paying currently? The average cost is $110, and the median is $90. And for those of us who blocked out our stats classes in high school and college, the average basically is, it's just the mean, looking at all of the costs and averaging them across, dividing by the number of people that responded. But you can have outliers, so some folks that pay a very large sum can kind of shift that average higher than it otherwise would have been if everything was clustered evenly. The median is really the center point. So if you take all of those scores and you find out the center point of that distribution, that's the median, which tends to be more representative. We asked them what is the fair cost of internet service? So the median came out to around $50. And what's the maximum that they would be willing to pay for service from the township? And that came up to about $60. And again, half are above and half are below. And you'd want to look at the demographics of what those groups look like, but that gives you a good sense for where some of that pricing could, and at least where the conversation would start. Do you support a millage for broadband? You can see that well over 65% of the folks say yes. So there's definitely an appetite. What kind of services to see online? Well, events. They want to see more communication on what's coming along, consistent with some of those earlier questions on what they would like to be informed about. Maybe the town hall meetings broadcasting as well on that, or at least some additional advertising about events that are coming up, the township meetings, and what the topics are going to be. People would like to do their bill payments without a service charge. And also some additional things that they could pay on using some of the online utilities. And for utility services themselves, I think people felt the current bill payment process was a little bit clunky. And so taking a look at that to see if there's some simplification that could be done. We asked about township services that are most important to the household. The big three are what we see all the time: fire and ambulance, police services, road maintenance, and then we've got a number of things that are kind of the second place areas. So township parks, trails and pathways, and then public water and sewer for your next set of services. We asked them what kind of community amenities they would like to see added or improved. And there are a number of things that were spread out. And you can see the number one thing, really, again, the walking and biking trails came out. Number two was sidewalks. You can see the pop-up pedestrian spaces also came up here with about 30% of your response. So then there were some very specific kinds of ideas that were floated across for the residents to consider. And you can see that improved broadband access was the number one thing. Over 50% were interested in that, and also expanding and enhancing the trails and pathways. So those were your big two. A couple of close contenders were expanding the solar and other green initiatives, and then investing in upgrading and modernizing the water and sewer facilities. And then the last question, do you support the deer management program? And overwhelmingly over 80% said yes, they do. People realize that there's some real safety issues as well as issues with the health of the herd. Okay, so that was the lightning tour of the results. Just to orient it to you, I believe you all have copies of the presentation, of the crosstabs, of the comments. So there's hours and hours of reading enjoyment ahead of you as you start diving into that, if you haven't done so yet. But before you digest, do you have any questions now that would be helpful for me to answer while you've got?